about 30, so we'll make a start if we may. I'm Steve Cummings, I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here, both colleagues and ladies and gentlemen in the room, and of course a large number of people who are joining us online. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce the professorial lecture of Professor Sarah Perks. Sarah is a curator and writer based in the Tees Valley and has created exhibitions, books and projects across contemporary art, design, science, film, history and beyond. She is our Professor of Curating at the School of Arts and Creative Industries here at Teesside University, which includes the internationally renowned Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art. And she is the research lead for Teesside University's Centre of Culture and Creativity. She's also currently co-leader for our master's level apprenticeship course in curating and art psychotherapy, and leads for Natural Futures, which is a collaborative project on creative nature recovery and eco-psychology. Sarah's interdisciplinary research is on relational curatorial strategy and its creative intersection with socio-economic, environmental and political issues. Her back catalogue of exhibitions and projects have included Imitation of Life, on performance of racial politics, Return of Memory, which is around the legacy of the Russian Revolution, the Asian Triennial Manchester, and international artist presentations including Rosa Barber, Phil Collins, The Living and the Dead Ensemble, and Noura Fashan Mirza and Brad Butler. She's been one of the Creative Review's 50 creative leaders and co-curated the UK's first major retrospective of David Lynch with her frequent collaborator Dr. Omar Khalif. Collaborative publications include Artist Moving Image in Britain since 1989 and One Day the Sadness Will End. Sarah is also Programme Advisor in Artist Moving Image for BFI London Film Festival, and her previous roles include the inaugural Artistic Director at Multi-Art Form Centre Home. And that opened in 2015. And she's currently a trustee of the Alchemy Film and Arts in Scotland and the new broadcasting platform Arts Post 21. So it's with great pleasure I introduce Sarah, and I'm really looking forward to the lecture. And so I'll hand over to you. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you everyone for joining here and online and of course in the future. Tell me how it goes. Just before I start, I just want to mention two very quick things. First of all, I just want to express my it's very hard for me to express my extreme sadness at the death of Emily Hess this week, who's a fantastic artist, and her spirit, I'm sure, will live on through her amazing work. And also, I didn't mean to clash with COP27, but I think it's quite fitting, and it's important that we understand what we can do, but also what a change in the power structures can do too. So as pointed out by peers and students, I have been overusing the word future and futures, sorry about that. It's like I can't help myself. What I'm really trying to do is talk about today with a bit of distance, as any consideration of history or future has to come from now, this very moment that we're in. The past is extremely important to me, however, essentially it's as unknown as the future, as its value always depends on so many aspects and positions. My past does not look like yours, so how can we begin to talk about the future together? I can, however, start by trying to answer some questions. So what does curating look like now, and what might it look like in the future? How might curating be an or one answer for our troubled times? And how does thinking about the future today help us with curating, or vice versa? Like all good curators, I didn't want to be a curator. I thought it sounded awful. I wanted to be a pop star, and then I decided on academia. My research was in visual culture and post-colonial identity in Hong Kong and India, largely building on my studies then as a film historian. And I spent a lot of time giving my then university, Manchester Metropolitan, a lot of grief to decolonise. which to be fair, they took on and asked me to create lectures, which I did, incorporating everything from South Korean New Wave to China's fifth generation into a previously Eurocentric offer. The same day I got my PhD funding on exhibition and distribution of Bollywood cinema in the UK since 1975, basically since the film Sholay. I also got offered a job at Corner House in Manchester. I took on both at the time and set about creating film education programs, then visual art education, and then I took over leadership of the whole program. I declared at the time that we would run without curators and have a really flat structure, everyone on the same level. And it actually really changed the culture to something quite positive and exciting and fresh. Though in reality, I did let the curators come back and ultimately had the sort of horrifying personal discovery that by creating projects and exhibitions, what I was actually doing is being a curator, albeit a very collaborative one. So I just wanted curators to be more sharing and collective in spirit. I couldn't see why an encyclopedic knowledge of anything was especially helpful. Note that's not the same as thorough research. Plus I felt that the how of relations with communities and people was lacking. So through film and participation, I found myself entering contemporary art at the moment that both were popular within it, riding the waves of a movement called relational aesthetics. In short, work made using human social relations. I also felt that contemporary art was embracing much more expansive ideas at a faster rate than other disciplines, embodying a certain wildness, if you like, that didn't seem as much present in film, theatre, design, literature, etc. But the more I tried to reinvent myself into a contemporary art curator, the more I found all the things I tried to leave coming back to haunt me. Academia, film, music, writing, cultural studies, identity politics. The fact that only book chapter I wrote during the first bit of the pandemic lockdown was about Madonna and cultural theory is, I guess, quite revealing. So as a curator and professor of curating, I use 3 words to describe my curatorial practice: relational, interdisciplinary, and wild. By relational, I mean it's collaborative and engagement focused. I often describe it as people, not objects, but actually, it's a bit more than that. But that's really just to emphasize that the object, whatever it is, doesn't do anything by itself. It's the connection with someone else that makes something happen. And I don't want to restrict the relational to people either. The connection could be with something non-human. And by interdisciplinary, I mean involving 2 or more different subjects or areas of discipline to create new knowledge. Again, not restricted by any specific imagined boundary, whilst also respecting both the context and also notions of justice. And as for wild, come back to that in a minute. So an example of an exhibition of mine to illustrate is called La Movida, which is also the name of the historic moment that inspired it. An outpouring of hedonistic and artistic activity following Spain's transition to democracy post-Franco. So this was a project for Home Manchester, and I brought together work on adaptation and appropriation from cultural and film studies to sort of contest the canonization of contemporary art, positioning La Movida within theories of transgression, obscenity, capitalism and queer theory, class and youth subcultures. There was an interdisciplinary diverse selection of artists, curatorial advisors and writers across positions, timeframes and places, and brought into a multivocal exhibition format. These included Ori Ashery's Party for Freedom, Obscenity by Bruce LaBruce. When they showed in the original gallery in Madrid, it was firebombed, and Derek Jarman's Black Paintings, Chim Pom's Provocative Works, Historical Feminist Works by Linda, and new commissions with artist-writer Lauren John Joseph. We commissioned award-winning film Aliens by Louis Lopez Carrasco about Tessa Aranz, a member of the major La Movida band Los Zombies, who now paints pictures of aliens whilst recalling the movement, and also a provocative queer performance pictured here by Alejandra Cinque. Audience feedback revealed new knowledge around class, subculture, and also comparisons with present-day UK issues, such as censorship, rolling back of certain freedoms, and issues around Brexit. I intended to push the boundaries and really to make the whole project about transgression, but by the end of 2 years of R&D, it became much more about activism against a rising populist right, and also how subculture or subcultures might form resistance. In the introduction to the guide, I describe how my representation of a historical moment produces an event much like the movement itself, contradictory, confusing, eclectic, invigorating, and hopefully a little bit out of control. The literary publication that accompanied Dark Habits, co-edited with Brian O'Callaghan, was refused at the printers, who labelled it obscene in an ironic turn of events, and even more ironic that it wasn't even that explicit. I especially like the tagline that I penned, "In these dark times, we might need even darker habits." The book had an amazing roster of poets, writers, and artists, including Heather Phillipson, Shimon Bazar, and Patricia McCormack. An extract from Heather Phillipson recalls Wildness through her pet dog, Marge. "Like a dog, my species has had some influence over my life, and an immense one on my art and livers. But mainly, like all living species, my species is alive. Dogs and humans die in the same way. The only significant difference is we spend our lives trying not to wonder how and what terrible silence will rip us out of this world." Only 5 years later, it seems the world is in a very different place and institutions are very risk averse. I guess an understandable position, all things considered. Myself and Dr. O were lamenting this very point on the Art Post 21 podcast recently, recalling our work on an earlier exhibition, Imitation of Life, Melodrama and Race in the 21st Century, which introduced the first UK institutional presence of many artists, including Lauren Halsey, Martin Sims, and Jacoby Satterwhite. Please note this isn't about seeing wildness as transgression, avant-garde, or in any way outsider, or other. It's about finding a more inclusive place for everyone and things to coexist together. Wildness as a place where you can be yourself with others, all in the same mess together, so to speak. So one of the shocking things about Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter is the reveal that they had a curatorial team to fire. Twitter had a whole curatorial team. What exactly has happened to curating? There's lots of amazing things to use in the history of curating. It's a gift to any curatorial manifesto from the moment it sprang eternal. So it's to do with Roman civil servants, religious curers of souls, shamans and alchemy, Renaissance cabinets of curiosities, Victorian hoarding, a line in science that leads us to today's curators in cell research, and my personal favourite, zookeepers, who are now more often, and rightfully so, called zoo curators. There is usually a link back to the Italian word cura, literally to care, and I would argue it's only more recently that curators became very much associated with contemporary art, and it's not an association that needs to stay necessarily. However, I really would not recommend putting one's face into this large sea lion or seal so closely. So there's an interesting, twisty curator journey that leads us to the 20th century, and particularly to museums often built out of a Victorian era obsession, usually Western and colonial, with objects and post-war public access to culture and collections, leading to a proliferation of museums, art galleries, and biennials, which of course you can then trace back to the 19th century great exhibitions. Then in the 21st century, the rise of the international mega museum and blockbuster exhibitions. Exhibitions and museums also began a two-way relationship with industrial interior design that persists today, with any Apple store at the forefront of the example. So I've really enjoyed reading histories of curation, but there's still a lot to be written, especially as it's a Eurocentric canon and it's cementing itself across textbooks and popular curation books as we speak. But dissecting that is another project. Here I'm talking about activity since the 90s, both the era of the superstar curator, which achieved a new makeover for the profession, and also the time when educational courses really started to appear in curating, many of which were aligned to contemporary art. In the new millennium, curating entered the age of the turns, which happened in a lot of fields, to be fair, turn meaning a swing towards something that sweeps across a discipline. For example, the discursive turn, the educational turn, the relational turn, the decolonial turn, and of course the curatorial turn itself. This was coined by Daniel Birnbaum for the Venice Biennial in 2009, and it means thought exhibitions, a new type of criticality, more like a book as opposed to a survey or a showcase. Though this was certainly not the start of a more, this wasn't the start of a more academic and thematic approach being adopted that had happened before, nor was it the first introduction of post-colonial or other positions within curating. So the 2020s saw mass biennialization. This had been brewing for a while, but now there are so many, they're so ubiquitous that they warrant a study all of their own. And biennials, sometimes triennials, etc., popped up in small civic situations and big international settings, funded in all sorts of different ways, and stretching across all corners of the creative sector. So we find ourselves in the present with the expansion of curating, already well written, but still potentially poorly communicated. The usage and definition of the words curate, curating, and curation have changed forever, as confirmed by the respectable dictionaries. And higher education courses, such as our own masters, are breaking new ground in terms of being applicable across a range of areas, including outside of the culture industry, and also being the first master's level vocational curatorial apprenticeship. There's also informal curatorial training programs across the country, including a program at the South Bank Centre and also Cornwall Museums Partnership. The current usage of the role is very scalable, so you can be amateur with your wardrobe, your laptop, or professional from the hyperlocal to an international setting, which I feel is a very positive sign, although current rhetoric tends to focus on the extremes, which in itself is probably a reflection of wider societal changes. So in his rather lofty book, Curation and the Power of Selection in a World of Excess, basically arguing how curation became a business strategy for US tech giants and a way of helping people choose what they buy, Michael Baska clumsily ends with a plea for curatorial literacy and good curators to defeat the mass manipulation by algorithms, or potentially just the bias of the algorithms themselves. He feels that these might help stop fake news, but he's essentially talking about media editors here, and imagining that there might be some conclusive or communal idea of what is good, and obviously is not foreseeing Elon Musk. This book is full of terrifying examples of so-called curation, the Canadian banking industry, jam and dishwasher tablets separately. Mostly he has just forgotten the word editorial exists, and a prize-winning analogy for me is the infamous bouncer at Berghain, the mega techno club in Berlin, who apparently curated the audience in multiple ways. Yes, I'm one of those victims of his curating. I should have spoke English. Ich weiß. David Blazer's book, Curationism, is a more sophisticated version of a book on how curating became such an everyday word and how it bubbled over from contemporary art and its relationship now to labor and popular culture. So he considers the downsides, a description of RuPaul calling Madonna a curator in the more shady sense of cultural appropriation to illustrate the vampiric potential of curating. Debate on Madonna Still Live, see my chapter in Pop Stars on Film Bloomsbury, out February. And Gwyneth Paltrow as Goop Lifestyle curator, enough said. And through considerations of unpaid curation and curation driven by anxiety. Both this and other books consider technology and this anxiety that it creates, and the fact that that made us all into curators through the internet and social media, but also that that technology is then needed to employ them to somehow manage or police the space in some way. The recent Twitter staff call headlines show us how technology has forged a new relation with curation, and to a certain extent still tied into this idea of care in the picture with regulation or self-governance. So it's important to acknowledge that the problems of contemporary curation and its multiple uses, important to keep an awareness of this whilst also embracing the new definitions. So Paul O'Neill and others have led the description of an expanded contemporary curatorial practice using the visual arts. Fleur Watson's The New Curator Exhibiting Architecture and Design pummels the design museum sector to channel the curator by chapter in the following way. So curator as space maker, as translator, as interloper, as speculator, as an agent, as a dramaturge, and as a specialist practice. So there's a clear narrative across this and other texts for curators tuning into the world's consciousness, politically in the widest sense, and a responsiveness now demanded by the new curator. So we have an old but actually kind of young field. It's still tiptoeing its way outside of the museum through university grad courses and sort of staring into a world of overwhelmingness. The first provocation I want to add here is that curating often has a closer relationship to politics and the socio-politic than other disciplines. Curating involves the combination of a selection of and an interpretation or engagement with publics to a much higher degree than other disciplines, in effect. I'd argue it's about responsibility, or perhaps more appropriately, authenticity. At once, the curator is a combination of historian, anthropologist, facilitator, writer, researcher, journalist, Marcom's manager, presenter, alongside some subject specialism and every practical element required of a curator. The curator of the future doesn't need to necessarily do all these in oneself, but does need an understanding of how to use or how to get. And arguably, curating draws so heavily from a wide range of disciplines, including cultural and critical theory, writing, spatial design, technology, education, communications, and producing. So whilst an artist or writer might take full responsibility for their work, here the curator takes responsibility for many people's work, and crucially, how, where, and when this work operates in the world. This dual function has to consider the socio-political context of its representation. For example, you wouldn't create an exhibition about a topic, ignoring any recent developments or headlines on that topic. For example, your Twitter exhibition would have to mention Elon Musk, unfortunately, and you would have to engage with a political understanding of the topic and any implications on potential participants, viewers, and experiences. It's obvious that this could get very complex and go downhill quickly like Facebook algorithms, or you are just unable to say anything by considering everything. I would argue instead that this is an opportunity within this proximity to politics for curating to be realized in a more multivocal approach or rhizomatic format. And by multivocal, I mean many voices, separate perspectives and narratives as opposed to only one. And rhizomatic, or rhizome, as in the Deleuze and Guattari's theory that allows for multiple non-hierarchical entry and exit points in data representation and interpretation. And these approaches reflect a wildness. Let's let things grow together. And here curating, as opposed to a single text of some kind, could have an important socio-political role in visioning the future, as people look for help in understanding the complexity and the contradictions. So another example, Natural Futures, is an ongoing project at the intersection of creative social action, eco-psychology, and nature recovery. Our first workshops, piloted early this year, are an adaptation of the Council of All Beings, developed in the 1980s in Australia. See the publication Thinking Like a Mountain Towards a Council of All Beings by John C., Joanna Macy, Pat Fleming, and Nan Ness. And continued on through the work of Joanna Macy and Chris Johnston in particular, whose publications include Active Hope and Coming Back to Life. Our Natural Futures eco-psychology workshops invite participants to imagine they're an aspect of nature, creating a mask or a headdress to become a bee or a bamboo, a mountain or a mole, an octopus or an ocean. Participants are welcomed by trained facilitators. We train 12 creatives locally who introduce the process. Setting the scene is really important to anyone new to this type of activity. And then the workshop begins by making a mask or a headdress with art materials together before starting the council process. This experience then asks them to consider everything from the perspective of the aspect of nature that they chose, and a performative council ritual follows where they speak on behalf of it. This pilot study was commissioned by Natural England as they launch the UK-wide nature recovery networks and embark on an unprecedented 20-year strategy to recover, rewild, regrow, and preserve vital ecosystems. This project challenges assumptions around understanding and access with groups underrepresented in the environmental sector, whilst amid increasing evidence that nature connectedness is critically important to fostering pro-environmental behaviours. So research by the University of Derby, Natural England, and others shows that visits to natural sites or being in nature alone are not enough, nor are they necessarily inclusive. So workshops last around 90 minutes, which is both the typical standard length of a theatre performance or a film, and incidentally also the amount of time spent walking in nature that a recent Stanford University study demonstrated actually changed the brain for a lower risk of depression. So the Natural Futures workshops have been developed by a collection of organisations, including Shida Khan from Borderlands, Rachel Murta from the Tees Valley Nature Partnership, and myself from Mima and Teesside University. So together we've been working on how to build new inclusive participation and engagement with environmental issues using the arts and creativity to communicate these sometimes overwhelming messages about our natural world. And this pilot explores the importance of rethinking what nature spaces and nature experiences are, as stated in Natural England's Included Outside report series, and is a clear call to action for me for some curatorial strategy. So 110 participants joined these pilot workshops targeting older people, people living in low-income areas, people from ethnic minority backgrounds, and people living with disabilities. And of course, many of those intersect. 80% found they had a greater connection to nature by the end of the workshop. 40% had never taken part in nature activities before, and 25% never in art or creative activities. Over 90% of the participants would take part in more art and creative activities and more nature-related activities. Interestingly, 3 people selecting art and creativity, but not nature. 100% of the groups would be happy to be contacted again by the Natural Futures project. So these workshops led to nature connectedness via creativity, effectively forming what I call empathy pebbles to the stepping stones within nature and environmental sector. Something that encourages action or further engagement through a change in attitude. Further Natural Futures workshops by my colleagues here include the Fern Extinction Bingo and the powerful Erasing Lost Animals with illustrator Amy Dover, and also the Assembly of Actions and Performance by Dr. Paul Stewart, developing a group nature manifesto using tools such as bamboo structures and karaoke. One of our facilitators with the young people, not in education, employment or training, talked of a very quiet male participant who became very activated after making a mask and became very passionate and emotional about the local oyster catchers being disturbed and displaced by the building of a Lidl nearby. He really came out of himself and surprised the rest of the group. And at another group, a community leader spoke of how they stopped the installation of bright security lights to protect owls and wildlife following taking part in the workshop. Let's go back to defining what I mean by wild. So here I'm inspired by several texts that look at different ways of forming curatorial perspectives. While it isn't highly original to resort to Donna Haraway or other popular texts, including the mushroom at the end of the world, etc., I find myself returning and rereading as I move further into ecology and ecopsychology as a new area of research. There's a reason why Donna Haraway is so popular. For me, the cyborgs are okay, but staying with the trouble, making kin in the Thulacine is where she really comes into her own. Where, whilst I'm still sat on a half-written book that merges dog psychology, confessional memoir, and cultural theory, Haraway just cracks on with it, no doubt aided by her fantastic network and a background in evolutionary biology. So staying with the trouble is a way of getting and making together in the Thulacine era, which is Haraway's name, her alternate to the human-centric post-Anthropocene. So this book asks us to be truly present now as a way of dealing where we are. In urgent times, she purposely uses urgent as opposed to emergency. And in her words, not as a vanishing pivot between awful or Edenic past and apocalyptic or salvic futures, but as mortal critters entwined in myriad unfinished configurations of places, times, matters, meanings. Haraway practiced what she preaches, collaborating widely, quoting generously from art and science alike. So staying with the trouble and its kinship theorists, Bruno Latour and Anna Singh in particular, covered too vast a territory to serve as a curatorial textbook alone. Myself and my MA Curating crew are pretty much in agreement about the book that does. Maura Riley's curatorial activism holds the ideas of curatorial responsibility that we subscribe to, and it also works through inequalities via data-driven histographies. Exhibitions with 90% male artists happened not that long ago, and highlighting those actively seeking equality. One of her ending key questions is almost a manifesto of mine now. If we cannot help others to see the structural and systemic problems that exist, then we cannot even begin to fix them. How can we elicit sympathy to the point of action? And even more relevant to the concept of wildness, how do we denaturalize what is perceived as natural? Queer theory and working through notions of desire have also led my research to notions of wild elsewhere. So back on home safe cultural studies terrain, Jack Halberstam's epistemological study Wild Things, The Disorder of Design, uses wildness to resist sexual boundaries and colonial narratives, effectively seeing it as a way both to embrace queer perspectives and also a framework for testing constraints. Halberstam also cautions responsibility with wildness not being either a glorious, unspoilt past or an exciting, machinic future. There's also another book by design historian and theorist Judy Atfield called Wild Things, The Material Culture of Everyday Life, which really embraces the idea of attitudinal design, arguing for importance of design of everyday objects in particular, which is picked up more recently by Alice Hawthorne in, of course, Design as an Attitude. Both are decolonizing and reimagining design theory and practice as socially and environmentally engaged, and they all underline that we can't dial out of urgent issues, but we can rethink our approaches and embed a certain wildness. So for me, wild is a resistance of binary oppositions or of structural and systemic oppression, and a call to embrace an idea of rewilding as central to curatorial practice and to experiment a way just to achieve that. Social and environmental justice will no doubt be looked back on as the leading discourses of the 2020s. Last week, the current UK Prime Minister was shamed into going to COP22 when he tried to stay in and do his homework instead, revealing of the temperature check around the climate crisis right now. Curators are encountering even stronger considerations of identity politics and intersectionality and of socioeconomic inequality than ever before. For museums, the issues of decolonizing and representation loom large, alongside the implications of and practicalities around climate change. How can we get to a curatorial thulacene, avoiding traps of pessimism, optimism, and also how to stop giving the humans all of the airtime? We already see curators across a number of new fields, for example, in health and the environment. Sure, they're mostly working with existing collections or on art projects or with artists, but this is how things start. For me, it's where the role starts to form beyond an artistic object or collection that it gets really interesting. For example, where a collection becomes a forest or an ocean, and that care of engagement with is as important as the collection itself. I hope for a surge towards a notion of curatorial recovery that rejects the elitism of the sector and as a backlash to even more recent conservatism and a willingness to embrace a spirit of experimentation. So let's take all of these things plus the opportunity of the expansion of the word and the field, and let's push curating to go really, really wild. So 5 traits of a future curator and potentially how to make them wilder. Relational and collaborative. I would say this, I know. But I can't really compute how it wouldn't be about connections, principally but not limited to people. How to make this wilder? New ecosystems that embrace the profession of curating and embed them in different sectors and places. Curators, change your inner ecosystems and embrace forms of attitudinal curating. Technologically enhanced. So perhaps not driven by, but able to use digital and data in smart new ways. The pandemic really showed how crap a lot of museums were in terms of digital curation, and also how naive everyone was in thinking that the internet would reach everyone. How to go wild. I think just throw out the rulebook on this one and start again. Try to look beyond the inherent disappointment and anxiety wrought by technology, especially social media, and let's find ways to embrace this technology, or better still, subvert it. Research, prediction, and evaluation. These sound really boring, but they're so important to curating. How to go wild. I suggest what Fleur Watson explains as, the imperative is to reveal the incomplete. It is about prototyping, experimentation, failures and successes, and the audience can take part in this experience as testing site. Here we might also explore the opportunistic aspects of being a curator, ideally opportunities for new connections. As Watson goes on to describe, opening and exposing new gaps to allow the introduction of new works, ideas, and debates in real time, some speculative or paradoxical that are set against the context of the larger whole. Collections. So the future curator will still draw on collections and conservation commitments, but hopefully with a new lens of experimentation. And how to go wild, just begin to see collections as something else entirely. Communities, animals, air. Design and communication skills will be, I think, more highly rated. And how to go wild, do more stealing from these disciplines and wildly translate them into curating. For example, around cutting edge design thinking or biophilic design. And then my 5 most likely settings for curators in the future are still the museum and gallery, in other sectors, health, environment, corporate business, councils, hopefully new sectors that don't exist yet. And the independent curator, I hope, still exists and can move around fairly freely. The digital curator, so people with a real focus on working within that digital space and understanding exactly how it works and how it engages people. And of course, the university curator. So as I've covered, the recent widening out of curator from music playlists, wardrobes to content curator, they mean editors, has upset many. And for me, we have to embrace the expansion and work out how to use this credibly and rewild where we can. It's fine to be an artist or a scientist at 8 years old, so why not a curator? Of course, many future professional curators will choose to specialize in subjects or fields, but also many will move across a wide range of industries or areas. Curators have often come from other fields or sideways entry points, and this is what invites curating as a sort of interdisciplinary den or a compost heap. Curators of the future are just as likely to specialize in a type of experience or to engage a demographic or net zero or non-human. And my hope is that they become as important to all types of projects and teams as an accountant would be, but a little bit more exciting. The curatorial recovery. I'd like to see more curator posts in all sorts of places and see curatorial strategy adopted everywhere, but not as a cynical marketing technique. This is responsive curating, after all. Wider and wilder understanding of the profession of curation with engagement and politics at its center, and how actually everyone can use curatorial strategy in their own areas, in brackets, responsibly and authentically. Inhabit a certain flexibility to resist conservatism and binary positions and embed wildness and experimentation. So we know now that rewilding is much needed for nature recovery, and we can expand this into an idea of a curatorial recovery. A curatorial recovery from traditional museums' colonial outputs, from the excesses of contemporary art nonsense, from the snobbishness to community arts, from the trying to constantly save or fix the world through design, but to obviously make connections for just transitions and decolonial purposes, and from humanity's futile attempts to remove itself from the toxic compost heap it created into an impossible utopia. Instead, let's just stay there and roll around, and potentially, perhaps, find a way out. Thank you. And I just want to say that this image was chosen for me or curated by PowerPoint itself. I just put the words in and it chose the moving tortoise or turtle or whatever it is.
Sarah, thank you very much for that really excellent and interesting talk. We probably have some time for some questions if there are any questions in the room. I'll open that up now.
Thank you, Sarah. That was totally brilliant. One of your 5 curatorial principles was, I think, technologically enhanced.
Yes.
Could you tell us a bit more about that? Because I'm quite interested, as a curator myself, in how we might embrace some of those algorithms and machine learning in the future of curating. Have you come across any projects that do that, or have you got any thoughts on how that might happen?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And actually, there's not as much out there as you would think in a way. And I think that's what really shocked me about the pandemic and how revealing it was that the use of digital technology in curating and possibly in the whole kind of creative sector, it wasn't advanced as we would be led to believe it. And I think also there's something about, this idea of messiness, this, Haraway's compost heap, which is similar to a lot of technical theories like the stacks theory and all of this kind of, mixing up of stuff, the levels, the intersections. So I think it's maybe working out how technology could help us with that. Bearing in mind all of the pitfalls and problems of it, and kind of enhance our ability to be quite rhizomatic, for things to be a bit more random. Feels like the technology at the moment is just kind of used to replicate a lot of issues in society or problems or prejudices of people, whereas if we can free it from that, maybe it can show us something else that's really exciting. And also perhaps there's a bridge here to more of the non-human world, so how we could communicate more effectively, whether that's with animals or nature or the Wood Wide Web or whatever we want to look into to explore. So there probably are amazing examples of this, and colleagues of mine that work at MIT and other places that are doing fantastic things. But for the moment, I think it's just trying to work out where to embrace it and what to do. Because I think also you could be a curator with just the knowledge of Microsoft Office. It's not something you have to use and do at the moment. So I think pushing that a little bit more could be really exciting. Thanks, Pippa.
Thank you. My interest is in the area of heart and artificial intelligence. And I'm happy you spoke about the future being technologically enhanced, and you spoke about the digital curator. But do you, in this future, what sort of ethical challenges did you foresee in this future we're looking at? The second question, so that you can address them together. I have observed that it appears arts, exhibition, curating seems to be for those people in the society I can consider elites. You hardly see the middle class in art exhibition. In this future, are we able to accommodate those we consider the lower class in curating and art generally?
Yeah. So the first one, the technological challenges, I think is, for me, technology is quite disappointing, as in it can't do what I want it to do. It's not as intuitive and it's not as smart as I want it to be. It's quite clunky, it's quite fiddly. And I feel like that whole, 20th century utopian promise, or that everything would be saved by technology, has just crumbled apart. And with social media being the kind of, most recent example of how kind of toxic technology can be. But of course, that's not to blame technology. It's just a tool that we use. So I think the challenge is how humans can actually use it in both just a better way and a way that I guess is more or at least democratic, or finding ways to make it more playful and experimental. So I think for me, the challenge of technology in the future and being used by curators is the technology going to be good enough? Are we going to get to places where we can just kind of, I want to be able to put maybe not a chip right in my head, but something close to me that enables me to talk to birds, for example. And we seem so far away from all of those ideas, actually, though I'm sure somebody is working on it. And then your question about inclusivity, socioeconomic inequality, and also class is just really important, and actually sort of the thing that's fueling everything that I do. So I grew up on a council estate in North Manchester, and I feel like people like me don't end up doing this kind of stuff, and they certainly don't end up giving these kind of lectures. So everything that I think about is really how to expand this profession, this whole area, and make sure people like me now don't kind of don't, not that I suffered in a sense, but have the same opportunities and are able to come here and be here and do really amazing things. And I think that a quality gap has widened as well. So I was one of the last people to get student fees paid for at undergraduate level, for example. So there's a lot of challenges, but there's also a lot of opportunities in things like the apprenticeships and how we use those for social mobility, for example. And I think in terms of going to, museums, art galleries, those kinds of things, yeah, they can be super like terrifying and very exclusive. So I think it's just where people like myself and others can do projects that, have a kind of multivocal and rhizomatic approach to that. So it's about having lots of different voices rather than one elite one that talks down or across or whatever to everybody, and having these different ways of accessing art, culture, or whatever it is. So for me, it's not even that important what type of art or whether we're talking about the environment or health. It's the methodologies, it's the strategies that we use to engage people. And that's where some of that like inherent bias and problems are. So how do we take those out, pull them apart so that we can reach, many more people and then ultimately non-humans as well.
Yeah, we have received two, so I'll just do one now and then give the rest of people a chance. Question received online is, do you think online curation is as memorable and relational as in-person curation? And if not, what increases this process?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not one or the other. It's not IRL or URL. It's that you can use both methods. And also there's some like hybrid in between as well that we can explore. So it's simply a little bit that a lot of URL curating has just not really developed. So it can be a bit clumsy. It can be a little bit like a slideshow online. I do quite like videos of exhibitions actually, and I think they also help in terms of access. So if you can see like, maybe a video of the place and then you go, it's a little bit less scary. But on the whole, having not just, the internet as a way of engaging or access to art and culture, but having online exhibitions that you visit and go to and experience, I think it's just, perhaps not quite there yet, but there have been some great examples. And I think as also VR and augmented reality improve, we'll start to, obviously with access issues around that, we'll start to see different types of online or meta or other like ways to experience exhibitions and projects. So yeah, not one or the other, but URL probably like just a little bit behind IRL sometimes. Thanks, Julian.
Yeah, I like the fact that a lot of these questions are kind of focusing on the technology. So my question is, so in what ways is a curating that is technologically / digitally enhanced not in collision with the concept of rewilding?
Yeah, this is true. And I guess this is where Donna Haraway helps quite a lot with this idea of staying with the trouble. We're not going to, on the one hand, we're not going to be nostalgic and return to anything. We're not going to create this pristine, perfect future. We're going to just have to get in this compost heap together. And that includes technology as much as the non-human, as people, everything in this mess. We don't want to refute it. We want to try and work with it, use it, subvert it if we can to help us. So that's where I, really do rely on Haraway in a way to help me through those thoughts and those conflicts and contradictions by, staying with the trouble in a sense, not being able to rewind it, not being able to fast track it into something utopian. Let's try to deal with the mess, technology, politics, all of these things, and hopefully in doing that in a sort of, multivocal way, will, it's not going to provide us with one answer, but it's hopefully going to provide us with different things and different options.
I like that you mentioned nostalgia because I can't remember who said it, but it was saying nostalgia is the sustainability of the future.
It is.
Right.
I would say it isn't. I'd say nostalgia is always a very dangerous thing. So for me, it wouldn't be sustaining anything. In fact, it's something to very highly question because it's the values of the past and it's usually the values of certain people and not everyone. So I'm always very worried about nostalgia. But what I think that quote maybe means, or the way I would look at it, is, ideas of restorative justice, reparation, being able to deal with the past, to reconcile, to make peace in order to move on to more, equitable futures. So that it could be just my different understanding of the word nostalgia in particular, but this idea of restorative is very something I'm really, really interested in.
You sure? I was just going to ask you, what do you think the barriers are to rewilding the curator?
Yeah, I think it's the things that are barriers in a lot of professions in a sense. People very comfortable, not needing to change, no pressure on people to change. The time it takes actually to do rhizomatic approaches or, you know, kind of deep ecology or engagement or whatever work it is, it's actually a lot of time. And that's not always, it's not that people, you know, don't have time, it's just not always something that people can do. Also, there's like a monetary value in a lot of this. If you really want to do like a really deep engagement project with a community, it's probably going to cost because there's all different things that you have to consider. It's not something you can necessarily do very cheaply. So, you know, I think that there is very practical reasons that become obstacles, and I understand that. But I also think, you know, here's where, in a sense, some of the like urgent issues of our times are pushing this. They're saying you can no longer not consider climate change. You can no longer not attempt to be inclusive. And that also happened in the commercial sector as much as the you know, academic or cultural sectors, because you want to sell things to all different people. So you have to understand there's all different people. So I'm hoping that some of these big challenges break down the barriers and make it essential to think about things in a sort of wild or rewilding way, using the restorative, using the technological, and also hopefully by the, you know, success. People follow success, they see things that happen, and they want a bit of that. And so I also, a bit rhizomatic and rewilding is the hope that people copy this, you know, share the lecture, copy the curatorial strategies. Thanks, Laura.
I really enjoyed your lecture, thank you. I have a question about the Natural Futures project, and about the workshops and the Council of All Beings and the kind of the transformative potential of that. I wondered, do you follow up with them later? Does this have a long-term effect on their understanding and their engagement and behaviour, or is it kind of just a moment in time?
Yeah, well, two sides to it. One, we did follow up a little bit. So we particularly followed up with the facilitators a few months later, because the groups were often in, you know, very sort of, you know, they might be in different situations. They're not ones you can necessarily pop by and just visit and say, hey, you're still thinking about that workshop. So we spoke to the facilitators as part of the pilot. And also we've really thought about how we can now go on to the next project, but build that in. We think that long-term evaluation and structure is really, really essential. Now we've sort of proved the beginning bit works. And then in order to work out how to properly evaluate, you know, behavior and changes of behavior, I was going to come back to you actually at some point and ask you for your advice. I mean, this is what we have to do, collaborate with the people that know and work with this. So this is sort of part of our next plan, to work out how, you know, part of it is the design of these empathy pebbles or projects and things, but part of it we need to nail is how to then evaluate it, because, you know, I had a conversation the other day about how do you evaluate empathy, like, or how do you measure it? Like, it's quite difficult. So do you have a think? Thanks.
Thank you everyone for those really interesting questions, and can we just thank Sarah again for that?
Thank you.